He was a Hollywood legend. But what made Robert De Niro risk everything for a little girl and her sick grandmother? A shocking mystery, and an ending that will change the way you think about heroes. Watch to the end. You will not believe what happened. Before we get to the video, let us know where you are watching this video and whether you liked it. And now let's dive in. Brooklyn, autumn 2025. The air smelled of wet asphalt and freshly brewed coffee from a small diner on the corner. The streets buzzed with a hum of cars, distant barking dogs, and snippets of passers-by's conversations. Amid this urban chaos stood an old apartment building, its brick facade cracked with age, the ground floor windows barred with iron grates. It was one of those neighborhoods where wealth and poverty lived side by side, separated by just a few blocks. Robert De Niro, now 82, but with eyes as sharp as in his youth, sat on a park bench across from the building. He wore an old baseball cap, a worn trench coat, and jeans to blend in. In his hands was a newspaper, but his gaze was fixed on a little girl playing near the building's entrance. Her name was Leah, no more than 7, her thin braids bouncing as she kicked a ball along the sidewalk. Robert had seen her here every day for the past week. And every day, his heart tightened at what he noticed. Leah lived with her grandmother, Ms. Margaret, in that same building. Robert had learned about them by chance when he stopped at a nearby cafe to wait out the rain. The bartender, an old Irishman named Sean, shared that Ms. Margaret was gravely ill, and Leah often wandered the streets because no one at home could look after her. "Poor kid," Sean had said, wiping a glass. "Her grandma can barely walk, and the landlord's threatening to evict them over 3 months' unpaid rent." Robert was no stranger to such stories. Growing up in New York, he'd seen neighbors thrown out on the street, families struggling to survive. But something about Leah, her quiet resilience, the way she smiled even when returning to a cold apartment, touched him. He couldn't just walk away. On the day it all began, Robert was on his bench when he saw a black SUV pull up to the building. Out stepped a man in an expensive suit, his hair perfectly slicked back, his eyes cold. This was Frank Costello, the local landlord, notorious for his ruthlessness. Behind him was another man, burly, in a leather jacket, carrying a folder of documents. Robert knew instantly, this wasn't a friendly visit. Leah, still kicking her ball, stopped and stared at the men. Her eyes narrowed, her small hands gripping the ball tighter. She knew who they were. Robert noticed her shoulders tense and quietly stood, holding his newspaper to look casual. Costello knocked on the door of the ground floor apartment. After a few moments, Ms. Margaret opened it. Her gray hair was tied in a messy bun, her face worn by illness, even paler in the daylight. She leaned on a cane, her hands trembling. "You again?" Her voice was weak but defiant. "I told you, I'll pay as soon as I get my pension." "Ms. Margaret," Costello said, smiling without warmth. "You said that last month, and the month before. I'm tired of waiting. Pay by the end of the week, or I'm filing for eviction." Leah, standing nearby, suddenly shouted, "Don't touch my grandma. We'll pay, I promise." Costello turned to her, his smile widening but sinister. "Oh, what a brave little girl. But promises don't pay rent, kid." He turned back to Ms. Margaret. "You've got until Friday, or I'll send people to throw you out." Robert felt anger rising in his chest. He'd seen men like Costello his whole life, people who profited from others' misery, hiding behind the law. But instead of storming over and making a scene, he took a deep breath and reminded himself, shouting wouldn't help. There had to be another way. He approached the group slowly, newspaper in hand, and cleared his throat. "Sorry to interrupt," he said calmly, his voice low but firm. "I overheard your conversation. Maybe there's a way to settle this without threats." Costello gave him a dismissive glance. "And who are you, neighborhood hero?" Robert shrugged, staying composed. "Just a guy who doesn't like seeing people bullied, especially sick women and kids." Ms. Margaret looked at him with surprise, while Leah stepped closer, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Costello, however, was unimpressed. Listen, old man, he said, stepping forward. This is business. If you want to play hero, pay their debt. Otherwise, stay out of it. Robert didn't flinch. He met Costello's gaze, and something in his eyes made the landlord hesitate for a moment. Business. Robert repeated. This isn't business. It's extortion. And I'm sure there are people in this city who'd love to know how you run your affairs. Costello laughed, but it was nervous. You threatening me? No, Robert said, his voice steady. I'm suggesting we talk. Name the debt. Maybe we can work something out. The man in the leather jacket, silent until now, spoke up. Frank, don't waste time. Let's go. Costello nodded, but threw Ms. Margaret a final warning. Friday. Don't forget. As the SUV drove off, Ms. Margaret turned to Robert. Thank you for standing up for us, but it won't change anything. I don't have the money, and the medicine costs more than I can afford. Robert crouched to Leah's level, who still clutched her ball. What's your name, kid? Leah, she said softly. Leah, I promise we'll figure this out. Your grandma won't end up on the street. Ms. Margaret shook her head. You're a kind man, but you don't know who you're dealing with. Costello has connections. He won't back down. Robert stood, his eyes narrowing. I know men like him, and I know how to talk to them. Over the next few days, Robert gathered information. He spoke to neighbors who were scared of Costello but shared rumors of his schemes, inflated rents, threats, even suspicions of tax evasion. He also learned that Ms. Margaret needed heart surgery, but without insurance, she couldn't afford it. One evening, as Robert sat in the cafe, Sean approached. Heard you're tangled up with Costello, he said, setting a coffee in front of Robert. Be careful. That guy doesn't like being crossed. I'm not looking for a fight, Robert replied. But I won't let that girl and her grandma lose their home. Sean nodded, his face serious. If you need help, I know a guy in City Hall. He might know how to put pressure on Costello. Robert smiled. Thanks, Sean. I'll let you know. That night, walking back to his temporary apartment, Robert noticed he was being followed. A dark figure in a hoodie trailed him a few yards back. He didn't panic, but his hand tightened around the keys in his pocket. Turning a corner, he stopped abruptly and spun around. Who are you? He asked calmly. The figure paused but didn't answer. After a moment, it turned and vanished into the dark. Robert realized. Costello knew he wasn't backing down. The stakes had just gotten higher. The next day, Robert returned to Ms. Margaret's building. Leah was on the steps, drawing with chalk on the sidewalk. She looked up and smiled. You came, she said. I knew you wouldn't forget. Never forget a promise, Robert said, sitting beside her. What are you drawing? Our house, Leah said, pointing to the sketch. And Grandma. And you. Robert looked at the drawing. Simple lines, but full of warmth. His throat tightened. Leah, he said quietly. I'll do everything to make sure you and your grandma stay here. But I need your help. Mine. Her eyes widened. Yeah, you know, all the neighbors. Can you tell me who else is having trouble with the landlord? Leah nodded, her face turning serious. I know. Mr. Gonzalez on the third floor said they raised his rent, even though his faucet leaks. And Mrs. Kim on the fifth is scared to complain because Costello threatened her. Robert listened carefully, mentally noting details. This was a start. If he could gather enough evidence, he might not only save Leah and Ms. Margaret, but stop Costello for good. But deep down, he knew trouble was coming. Costello wouldn't give up without a fight, and Robert hadn't yet revealed all his cards. Who was he really? Why was a man known worldwide hiding in the shadows of Brooklyn, helping strangers? And what would happen when the truth came out? Brooklyn exhaled the chill of early autumn. Fallen leaves rustled underfoot, and the scent of roasted corn from a street cart mingled with the sharp tang of exhaust fumes. Robert De Niro sat in his temporary apartment, a cramped, one-room studio with peeling wallpaper and creaky floors. On the table before him lay his notes from the past few days, neighbors' names, complaints about Costello, dates of rent hikes. It was a puzzle, and Robert knew every piece mattered. He'd already contacted Sean's friend, Tony Ramirez, a city hall worker with access to property records. Tony promised to check for violations in Costello's dealings but warned, "This guy's slippery as an eel. If he's breaking the law, he's careful not to leave a trail." Robert thanked him and urged him to hurry. Time was running out. Only 3 days remained until Friday, when Costello threatened to evict Ms. Margaret and Leah. Robert felt the tension rising. The night he was followed, he realized Costello wasn't just making threats. He was ready to act. But Robert wasn't backing down. He'd fought plenty of battles in his life, and this one, though not on a screen, was one of the most important. The next morning, Robert returned to Ms. Margaret's building. The sun barely pierced the gray clouds, and the air was heavy with dampness. Leah, as usual, sat on the steps, this time with a small notebook, scribbling something. Her fingers, red from the cold, gripped a pencil tightly. "Good morning, Leah," Robert said, sitting beside her. He noticed her jacket was too small, with a hole at the knee. "Hi," she replied, not looking up. "I'm writing down what the neighbors said." "Like you asked." Robert smiled. Her seriousness touched him. He glanced at the notebook. Neat, childish handwriting listed names and brief notes. "Mr. Gonzalez, leaky faucet, rent plus $200. Mrs. Kim, threatened with eviction for complaining about elevator." "You're doing great," he said. "This will help a lot." Leah finally looked up, her eyes a mix of hope and fear. "What if he kicks us out? Where will we go? Grandma can't walk far." Robert put a hand on her shoulder. "I won't let that happen. I promise." He knew promises were dangerous, especially against someone like Costello. But looking into Leah's eyes, he couldn't say anything else. The building's door opened, and Ms. Margaret appeared. Her face was pale, her breathing labored. She held the doorframe to keep from falling. "Leah, come inside," she said weakly. "And you, Mr. What's-Your-Name?" "Bob," Robert replied, using the alias he'd chosen to stay unrecognized. "Mr. Bob, I appreciate your kindness, but this isn't your fight. Costello won't stop. He's already evicted 2 neighbors last year." Robert stood, his voice calm but firm. "Ms. Margaret, I'm not looking for trouble. But I've seen men like Costello destroy lives. If I can do something, I will." She studied him with a long, searching look, as if trying to figure out who he was. Finally, she nodded. "Then come in for tea. I'll tell you what I know." Inside Ms. Margaret's apartment, the air smelled of old books, mint, and faintly of medicine. The furniture was worn but neat. Faded photos hung on the wall, a younger Margaret with her husband, Leah in kindergarten, family holidays. Robert felt a pang in his chest. This apartment wasn't just a home, it was a life Costello wanted to take away. While Leah heated the kettle, Ms. Margaret shared her story. A retired history teacher, her savings dwindled after her husband's death. 2 years ago, she was diagnosed with heart failure, and medication ate up most of her pension. Leah came to live with her after her mother, Margaret's daughter, died in a car accident 5 years earlier. "I don't want Leah growing up in a shelter," Ms. Margaret said, her voice trembling. "But I don't know how to protect her." Robert listened silently, his face unreadable but his eyes burning. He knew paying the debt wouldn't stop Costello. Something bigger was needed. "Ms. Margaret," he said finally, "do you have any documents about the rent? The lease, receipts, letters from Costello?" She nodded and pointed to an old wooden box in the corner. Robert reviewed the papers. The lease was cleverly worded, allowing rent hikes without notice. But Costello's letters contained threats that could serve as evidence. "This could help," Robert said. "But we need witnesses, people willing to speak." Messi said, shaking her head. "The neighbors are scared. Costello has people who intimidate." Robert recalled the hooded figure. He nodded. "Then we'll start small." That day, Robert organized a meeting with the neighbors. He asked Leah to distribute notes, inviting them to gather in the building's basement. To his surprise, 6 showed up, Mr. Gonzalez, an elderly man from the third floor, Mrs. Kim, a quiet widow from the fifth, a young couple, Anna and David, who'd recently moved in, and two others who didn't give their names but listened intently. Robert stood before them, holding a coffee he'd brought. "I'm not a lawyer or a politician," he began. "I'm just a guy who wants to help. You all know what Costello's doing. But if we stay silent, he'll keep going." Mr. Gonzalez raised a hand. "I've complained about my faucet for 2 years. He said he'd fix it if I paid more. I can't afford it." Mrs. Kim added softly, "He threatened to evict me when I asked about the elevator. Said I was causing trouble." Robert listened, taking notes. He felt the room's energy shift, fear mingling with anger. This was the moment people started believing change was possible. "We'll collect your stories," he said. "And I know someone who can get them to the right people." Anna, the young woman with bright red hair, asked, "What if Costello finds out?" "He has people who—" She didn't finish, but everyone understood. Robert looked her in the eye. "I won't let anything happen to you. But we need to act together." The next day, Tony Ramirez called with news. He'd found records showing Costello was dodging taxes on several properties, hiding rental income. It was a serious violation, but Tony warned, "We need testimony. Without it, it's just paper." Robert knew it was time to raise the stakes. He arranged a meeting with a local journalist, Emily Walker, who wrote about corruption in Brooklyn. Emily agreed to hear the neighbors' stories, but only if they'd speak openly. That evening, returning home, Robert sensed he was being followed again. This time, he didn't stop. Instead, he ducked into a 24-hour bodega, bought a pack of cigarettes he hadn't smoked in 20 years, and sat on a bench outside, pretending to wait for someone. The hooded figure lingered at the corner, but didn't approach. Robert pulled out his phone and called Sean. "I need your help," he said quietly. "Get a few guys you trust. Costello's playing dirty, and I want to be ready." Sean laughed. "You sound like you're in one of your movies, you know." Robert smiled, but his eyes stayed cold. "This isn't a movie. It's Leah's life." One day remained until Friday. Robert gathered the neighbors again, this time with Emily Walker. She recorded their stories, her tape recorder humming softly on the table. Ms. Margaret, though frail, attended and spoke about Costello's threats. Leah sat beside her, holding her hand. When the meeting ended, Emily said, "This could be a big story. But Costello will try to destroy you. Are you ready?" Robert looked at the neighbors. Their faces held fear, but also resolve. He nodded. "We're ready." That night, Robert couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, staring at Brooklyn's dark streets. He knew tomorrow would decide everything. Costello would either back down or hit harder. And there was still the question of Ms. Margaret's health. She was deteriorating, and even if they won this battle, without surgery, she wouldn't last long. Robert picked up his phone and called an old friend, a doctor at one of New York's top clinics. "John," he said quietly, "I need your help. There's a woman who needs surgery. I want it done as soon as possible." There was a pause, then John replied, "Bob, you never ask for favors like this." "Who is she?" "Just a good person," Robert said. "And her granddaughter deserves a grandma." He hung up and looked at Leah's chalk drawing. A thought crossed his mind. This isn't over yet. But deep down, he felt they were on the right path. Tomorrow would be tough, but for the first time in a long time, Robert felt he was doing something truly meaningful. Friday morning in Brooklyn was damp and cold. Fog settled on the asphalt, and the city sounds, car horns, distant dogs, squealing tires, felt muffled, as if the world held its breath. Robert De Niro stood by his apartment window, holding a cup of black coffee. His eyes, ever vigilant, now carried quiet determination. Today was the day it would all be decided. He checked his phone. A message from Emily Walker confirmed her article on Costello's schemes was ready to publish. Tony Ramirez sent copies of documents proving Costello's tax evasion. And Sean, the bartender, assured him that a few trusted friends, burly guys from the dockworkers union, would be nearby Ms. Margaret's building in case Costello played dirty. Robert didn't like intimidation, but he knew sometimes the presence of strength spoke louder than words. He slipped on his old trench coat, pulled his baseball cap low, and headed to the building. In his pocket was a small recorder, just in case. When Robert arrived, Leah was on the steps. She held her notebook, but wasn't writing. Her eyes were red, as if she'd been crying. Robert sat beside her. "What's wrong, kid?" he asked gently. Leah sniffled. "Grandma's feeling bad. She hasn't gotten out of bed. I'm scared She didn't finish, but Robert understood. He put a hand on her shoulder. "I'll call a doctor. We won't leave her alone, okay?" Leah nodded, but her small face remained tense. Robert pulled out his phone and called John, his doctor friend. John promised to arrive within the hour with a colleague to examine Ms. Margaret. Robert thanked him and turned back to Leah. "Listen," he said, "today's going to be tough, but I promise we'll get through it. Do you trust me?" She looked at him and slowly nodded. "You're like my grandpa. He always said everything would be okay." Robert smiled, but his chest tightened. He wasn't a grandfather, but over these days, Leah had become more than just a neighborhood kid. At 11 a.m., the familiar black SUV pulled up. Frank Costello stepped out, no smile this time. He was flanked by two men, the burly guy in the leather jacket and a wiry one with a nervous look. Robert stood by the entrance, hands in his pockets. Beside him were Mr. Gonzalez and Anna, the young neighbor with red hair. Mrs. Kim and David stood a little farther back, their presence lending strength. Costello shot Robert a cold glare. "You again, old man," he said, his voice sharp. "I told you to stay out of it." Robert didn't move. His voice was calm, but carried steel. "And I said we talk. Name Ms. Margaret's debt. We'll settle this now." Costello laughed, but it was strained. "You think you can just pay and be a hero? This isn't about money. It's about principles. She doesn't pay, she's out." Mr. Gonzalez stepped forward, his voice trembling with anger. "What about your principles? Raising rent without notice, threatening people, that's your business." Costello's eyes narrowed. "Watch it, old man. You don't know who you're talking to." "I know," Robert said. He pulled his phone from his pocket and turned on the recorder. "And I know you're dodging taxes on 5 of your buildings. There are documents and witnesses." Costello's face darkened. He stepped toward Robert, but the man in the leather jacket grabbed his arm. "Frank, don't. Not here." Robert continued, his voice steady, each word hitting its mark. "You've got a choice. Make a deal. Forgive Ms. Margaret's debt, fix Gonzalez's faucet, repair Mrs. Kim's elevator. Or tomorrow morning, the papers will run a story about your schemes. And trust me, people in City Hall are waiting to take you down." Costello clenched his fists, his face reddening. "You're bluffing." Robert shrugged. "Try me." Silence fell for a moment. Passers-by slowed, sensing the tension. Leah, standing behind Robert, gripped his sleeve tightly. Costello's gaze darted from Robert to the neighbors, as if weighing how far they'd go. Finally he spoke, his voice low and laced with venom. "Fine. Ms. Margaret's debt is cleared. But this isn't over, old man. You'll regret this." He turned and stormed to the car, his men hurrying after. The SUV peeled away, leaving only a cloud of exhaust. Anna exhaled. "Did we do it?" Robert nodded, but his face stayed serious. "It's just the start." An hour later, John arrived with a colleague, a cardiologist named Dr. Lee. They examined Ms. Margaret, who lay in bed, barely breathing. Leah sat beside her, holding her hand. Robert waited in the hallway, listening to the doctor's muffled voices. When John emerged, his face was grim. "She needs surgery, Bob. Urgently. She has aortic stenosis, and without intervention, she won't last a month." Robert nodded. "How much?" "Without insurance, about $100,000. But I can talk to the clinic. We'll figure something out." Robert looked at Leah, who was drawing in her notebook, and made a decision. "I'll cover it. Just make sure she gets the best care. John raised an eyebrow. You sure? That's a lot of money. I'm sure, Robert said. He didn't explain that over these weeks, Leah and Ms. Margaret had become more than just a cause. The next day, Emily Walker's article hit the local paper. The headline blared, "Brooklyn rental mogul under investigation. Allegations of threats and tax evasion." It quoted neighbors, their names changed for safety, and referenced documents from an anonymous source. City Hall launched a probe into Costello's dealings, and his name became toxic in local circles. Ms. Margaret was transferred to a clinic, with surgery scheduled for the following week. Leah stayed temporarily with Mrs. Kim, who took her in like a granddaughter. Inspired by their victory, the neighbors began forming a tenants' committee to protect their rights. Robert helped with legal advice, but stayed in the background, avoiding attention. One evening, as Robert sat in Sean's cafe, Leah approached. She held a drawing, a house, Ms. Margaret smiling, and a man in a baseball cap beside them. "This is for you," she said. "Thank you for saving us." Robert took the drawing, his throat tightening. "You saved me, Leah," he said softly. She hugged him, and for a moment, the world faded away. No Brooklyn, no Costello, no struggle. Just a little girl who believed good could win. Weeks passed. Ms. Margaret's surgery was a success, and she was slowly recovering. Leah returned to school, but drew new pictures for her grandma every evening. Costello vanished from her radar. Rumors said he sold several properties and left the state as the investigation heated up. Robert stood on the same park bench where it all began. He looked at the building, where the elevator now hummed and Gonzalez's faucet no longer leaked. Things were far from perfect. Poverty, injustice, and struggle remained. But a small step had been taken. And that step, like a seed, could grow into something more. He pulled Leah's drawing from his pocket and smiled. Maybe he hadn't changed the world, but for one girl and her grandmother, he'd changed everything. And that, Robert thought, was enough. He adjusted his cap and walked away, blending into the crowd. Brooklyn continued its life, but somewhere in its heart, a spark of hope had ignited. And who knew where it might lead?